Over Schweinfurt, Germany in August 1943, American bomber crews watched their fighter escort turn back at the edge of its range. What happens next becomes one of the costliest missions of the war, because no American fighter could fly far enough to protect them. 60 bombers gone in a single day. The aircraft that would finally close that deadly gap didn't exist yet, and it wouldn't come from any fighter America already had. It would begin with a British request, an unlikely manufacturer, and one engineer who refused to copy someone else's airplane. On August 17, 1943, the danger of unescorted daylight bombing became starkly clear. Of the 376 B-17 flying fortresses dispatched to strike the ball, bearing factories at Schweinfurt, only 316 returned. 60 heavy bombers fell, victims of an operational limit. The Allies had bombers that could reach deep into Germany, but no fighters that could go with them and return safely. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolts and British Spitfires of the period fought well at high altitudes, but their fuel tanks dictated a hard boundary. At the German border, low on fuel, they had to turn back, leaving the bomber streams completely exposed to enemy interceptors. Solving this fatal gap required a completely new design, not a modification of existing aircraft. The answer began with an unlikely chain of events: a British purchasing request, a daring flight by a British test pilot, and a California company that many in Washington initially dismissed as too small to matter. In February 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation at their Inglewood factory beside Mines Field. The British wanted licensed production of the Curtiss P-40, a fighter capable of 360 miles per hour. Curtiss factories were overwhelmed, but North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, questioned if copying an old design made sense. He asked chief designer Edgar Schmued if they could build something better. Schmued rejected the idea of building someone else's plane. Rather than spending months retooling to assemble an existing aircraft, he promised a clean design that would exceed 400 miles per hour. The British accepted the gamble, but issued a brutal ultimatum. They demanded a completed flying prototype in just 120 days. Edgar Schmued, the designer tasked with meeting this rapid deadline, possessed no formal engineering degree. Born in Hornbach, Germany, in December 1899, he worked as a teenage apprentice in a small engine factory while teaching himself aerodynamics. During the First World War, he served as a mechanic in the Austro-Hungarian Flying Service. Post-war economic ruin forced him to leave Germany, leading him to Brazil in the 1920s and then to the United States in 1930. When he arrived at North American Aviation in 1936, Schmued brought the practical grit of a self-taught technician. To cut drag, Schmued's senior aerodynamicist, Edward Horkey, proposed a radical, unproven design, a laminar flow wing. While conventional wings of the era created massive high-speed drag, Horkey's smooth airflow design promised a 30% reduction in skin friction. It was a massive production risk, requiring extreme manufacturing precision to maintain a perfectly smooth surface, but the team accepted the gamble. Working around the clock, the assembly crews achieved the near impossible. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the Inglewood plant just 117 days after the contract was signed, beating the strict British 120-day deadline by 3 days. But the speed of the build outpaced the engine supply. The aircraft rolled onto the tarmac without its Allison engine installed, and it sat on landing gear borrowed from a BT-9 trainer rather than its own designed undercarriage. On October 26, 1940, with a temporary engine installed, test pilot Vance Breese taxied onto Mines Field. The prototype took flight, proving the aerodynamics worked. When the evaluation models reached England, the Royal Air Force officially named the clean American fighter the Mustang. The Mustang's clean aerodynamics promised extreme speed, but its initial engine, the liquid-cooled Allison V1710, had a fatal limitation. At sea level, the Allison produced a strong 1,150 horsepower, but above 15,000 feet, its single-stage supercharger could not compress the thin air. Power collapsed, dropping to a weak 800 horsepower. The strategic air war demanded escorts that could operate at 25,000 feet, but the Mustang choked nearly 2 miles below that threshold. A machine that flew clean was not yet a machine that could fight high. Disappointed British commanders realized they could not use the Mustang for high-altitude escort. Instead, they restricted early models to low-level photo reconnaissance and ground attack missions along the French coast. In April 1942, at Hucknall Aerodrome, RAF test pilot Ronald Harker realized the clean American airframe was wasted at low altitudes. He argued it deserved the two-stage Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. Despite resistance within the Air Ministry, Rolls-Royce engineer Ray Dorey championed the project, prompting Air Marshal Sir Wilfred Freeman to authorize 5 experimental conversions. The result was instantaneous. Above 20,000 feet, where the Allison engine choked at 800 horsepower, the Merlin conversion unleashed over 1,600. Climb rates nearly doubled, surging from 2,200 feet per minute to over 3,500. The clean airframe had finally met the engine its shape was engineered for. An airframe that flew clean was finally built to fly high. The perfect design had found its perfect match. If you are fascinated by the engineering breakthroughs that turned the tide of war, subscribe now to catch every chapter. A custom-built prototype at Hucknall was a proof of concept, but winning the air war required manufacturing on an industrial scale. The solution lay in Detroit. In August 1941, the Packard Motor Car Company secured the license to mass-produce the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Packard's automotive factories retooled with high-precision machining stations to build the complex V1650 Merlin engine. By January 1943, the first batch of these American-built engines arrived at North American Aviation's assembly lines. The converted test aircraft now became standardized production models. The Inglewood plant built the P-51B, while a parallel line in Dallas produced the P-51C. But scaling the engine was only half the battle. High-altitude performance mattered little if the fighter still had to turn back at the German border. To convert this engine match into strategic reach, engineers increased internal fuel capacity from 184 gallons to 269 gallons, then added 2 75-gallon external drop tanks under the wings. The results redefined the geometry of the air war. While the standard Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was forced to turn back at its 400-mile combat limit, the Mustang's new configuration pushed its range past 1,600 miles, more than doubling the distance it could protect the formation. The escort gap was closed. For the first time, American bombers had a protector that could fly from bases in England, reach the heart of Germany, and return home on a single mission. A persistent rumor claims the Mustang was not a pure American design, but a secret descendant of the German Messerschmitt Bf-109. The story sounds plausible because of the visual similarities between the two fighters and the German birth of chief designer Edgar Schmued. It is said that Schmued worked for Willy Messerschmitt before emigrating. This claim is entirely false. Schmued never worked for Messerschmitt. He left Germany in 1925, a full decade before the Bf-109 first flew in 1935, and built his career at Fokker and North American Aviation. The visual resemblance was not a copy, but the result of independent engineers solving the exact same aerodynamic problems. The physics of drag forced both sides to similar shapes. The Mustang's lineage remains entirely Anglo-American. On February 13, 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group took off from RAF Boxted to escort 274 heavy bombers heading for the German capital. It was the first continuous escort mission to Berlin and back. High above the bomber stream, Merlin-powered Mustangs kept watch. The long-range escort problem had been solved. Before the arrival of these escorts, the strategic bombing campaign was pushing toward collapse. On distant missions during the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force suffered a devastating average loss rate of 7%. Out of every 100 bombers dispatched, 7 would never return. At that pace, a crewman's chances of surviving a 25-mission tour were mathematically impossible. With the Mustangs in the air, the equation changed. By the spring of 1944, bomber loss rates on maximum range missions plunged from that deadly 7% down to just 3%. Instead of facing constant, coordinated attacks from German interceptors over the target area, bomber crews looked out their cabin windows to see a reassuring silhouette. The heavy bomber crews gave this new protector a simple, enduring name, Little Friend. The nickname became a symbol of absolute trust. Where P-47s and Spitfires once had to turn back at the German border, the P-51 stayed. It escorted the bombers from the assembly point in England through the flat corridors of the Ruhr Valley, all the way to Berlin and back to base. During the August 1943 Schweinfurt raid, 60 B-17s had been lost in a single afternoon because they lacked protection. On the February 13th Berlin run, thanks to the Mustangs, only 4 bombers were lost, all to ground-based anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. During the high-altitude combat, the escorting Mustangs also claimed 6 German interceptors, proving they could dominate the defenders over their own capital. For the young men inside the cold, unpressurized bombers, the sight of the Mustang's distinctive wings was the difference between life and death. The true impact of this transatlantic project is written in the cold arithmetic of mass production. Against the original British Purchasing Commission contract of 1940, which was meant to supply a modest force of fighters, North American Aviation went on to manufacture 15,586 Mustangs of all variants by the end of the conflict. This massive manufacturing effort converted a rushed engineering design into an overwhelming physical presence over Europe. In combat, the fighter's contribution was defined by systemic destruction rather than single dogfights. In the skies, Mustang pilots claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, a figure paired with more than 4,300 additional German planes shattered directly on the ground during strafing runs. This double-edged offensive power did not just protect the bombers, it actively dismantled the defenders' ability to replace their losses. This was not an aircraft built for temporary local defense, but a tool of constant strategic pressure. The Mustang fleet completed more than 200,000 individual combat missions in the European theater alone. This vast operational output accounted for nearly 30% of all Allied fighter sorties, showing that a sustained presence across the entire continent was far more effective than isolated tactical victories. The combat data proved that an airframe engineered to fly clean could only fly high when backed by the full weight of a global industrial network. The final numbers confirm that this fighter was the definitive answer to a deadly wartime crisis. Two nations built one airplane, and neither could have finished it alone. Subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter of aviation history. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Mustang's mission shifted from combat survival to pure speed. In the post-war era, hundreds of surplus military fighters found a second life on the civilian air racing circuit, where modified Mustangs dominated the national air races for decades. In 1947, a modified P-51 captured the prestigious Thompson Trophy at an average speed of 362 miles per hour. By 1951, at the Muroc Air Force Base competition, another Mustang pushed the limits of piston engine flight even further, setting an astonishing pylon racing record of 425 miles per hour. The very airframe designed under a frantic 117-day wartime deadline was now setting peacetime speed records that challenged the dawn of the jet age. Today, more than 80 years after those initial flights at Mines Field, the Mustang remains a living legend. Of the thousands built during the global conflict, only a tiny fraction survives. Yet, remarkably, more than 150 original Mustangs remain airworthy around the world today. At air shows and historic memorial flights, the unmistakable roar of the engine still draws eyes to the sky. These flying survivors serve as a direct bridge between the harrowing daylight raids over occupied Europe and our present memory, keeping the legacy of their young crews alive in the hum of their engines. The man who drew those iconic lines, Edgar Schmued, did not stop with his wartime masterpiece. His pursuit of aerodynamic perfection transitioned seamlessly from propellers to jet propulsion. Schmued went on to design the F-86 Sabre, the swept-wing jet that secured air superiority over the skies of Korea, and the T-38 Talon, a twin-jet supersonic trainer that remains in active service with the United States Air Force today. His work earned him late but profound recognition. In 1991, 6 years after his death in 1985, Schmued was inducted into the International Air and Space Hall of Fame, cementing his place among history's greatest aviation pioneers. Looking back at the unlikely genesis of this fighter, its ultimate legacy offers a final, quiet truth. It reminded the world that while a clean airframe does not automatically fly high, the right partnership can make it touch the stars. True strategic dominance was not found in a single drawing board or isolated factory, but in the harmony of two allied nations working toward a shared purpose. Today, the skies we take for granted are shaped by this legacy of raw desperation. It proves that the most elegant airframe is useless without the power to lift it. In our modern world of solo superpowers, the Mustang remains a monument to absolute trust across an ocean. Two nations built one airplane, and neither could have finished it alone. Subscribe for more untold engineering stories.